My father said something very interesting about filmmaking. He was a director. But he said if you divide filmmaking into three parts, the preparation of the script, the casting, and all of the things that go before. The second being the shooting of the film, the directing of the actors and the actual shooting of the film. And the third being the editing, all the post-production, and the publicity and the release of the film. He said, if you put a gun to my head and said you have to give up one of those three functions, he said, I'd give up the directing. He said, but if the script is right and they shoot some film and I can get in the editing room with it, I can make it work.
In Hollywood, a new high for glamour is reached as Warner Brothers premieres George Stevens' production, Giant, based on a novel by Edna Ferber. An unprecedented turnout of more than 2,000 screen celebrities, other noted personalities, and press representatives arrive at the famed Chinese Theater on Hollywood Boulevard in a formal invitational event that dazzles 10,000 spectators under a canopy of sky-reaching searchlights. Three great star names in Giant: Elizabeth Taylor, Rock Hudson, James Dean. And here in the forecourt of the theater are the footprints and handprints of Giant stars and producer-director George Stevens.
George had always tried to do stories with great conscience. Place in the Sun was a tremendous moral story. Shane was a wonderful, wonderful film.
He was a distinctly American director, and he had a sense of the country and a sense of the land, and so I think Giant was very important to him.
George Stevens as a director was 10 plus. As a human being, he was very special, and he was also a 10 or a 10 plus.
George was wonderful with actors. He was tough on crew. He could be tough on crew because he was a perfectionist and he demanded a lot. But with actors, he just had a wonderful kind of camaraderie. He had a way of becoming whatever your character was, when he talked to you. And I remember the main scene I had in the picture was Christmas morning, when George was. That is when Bick tries to give Bob Dace talks to him about taking over the ranch eventually, and I bring out my greetings from President Roosevelt and say I can't because I've been drafted. And I remember George doing the entire scene, and we shot it from every conceivable angle. I mean, I'm literally from the backs of our heads we even shot it. But every time we shot that scene, every time I would bring out the greetings, I would hear George snickering off stage and off camera. I mean, he was so enthusiastic, and it was catching for actors. He was a joy to work with.
I asked a lot of people who had worked with him, what's it like to work with him? And they all, to one, said, just make yourself a piece of putty and put yourself in his hands, and he'll do it all.
He was also had great skill at working in the editing room to help actors in terms of performances, as it were, protecting them by choosing the right takes, by maybe not being on their face on a scene that they're having trouble with at a certain part of it.
He would go to great pains to go all the way around, over this way and that way, to make me think it's my idea, so that I would come up to him and say, George, I have a good idea for this scene. He'd say, what's that, Rock? And I'd tell him and say, yes, that's a good idea. And it was his all along. And he caught me every time. Every time. But it was really true that what everybody said, make yourself a piece of putty and put yourself in his hands and rely on him.
I was in a very good position when the Giant proposal came up because, as I said, I had just starred on Broadway. I'd gotten wonderful reviews. I was getting starring parts on television shows. But I was a little bit scared of movies. And I had several other offers, but I decided I'd rather take it a little easy. I'd rather have a part that didn't have to carry the film, and in which I had a great director, a great master to guide me through.
walked in the door, and I said, now this is what he said, because I don't use this language. He said, well, Jane, you're going to make a hell of a Vashti Snythe. And I said, I beg your pardon? He said, you're going to be Vashti Snythe and Giant. I said, oh, my land alive. I said, no, Mr. Stevens. When I said I wanted to share thoughts with you, I meant about the book and the different characters. He said, well, you'll get a good chance to find out, because we're going to be on the picture for quite a while, you know. And I said, oh no, I'm a mama now and I take care of 3 kids and I haven't worked in a long time. He said, well, we're going to have to do something about changing that.
You know, it's an interesting story how he came to this cast, and I don't know, you know, all of the details because I was apart from it when the casting was going on. I mean, I know that he talked with Audrey Hepburn. I understand he talked with Grace Kelly. There was talk of Bill Holden, and why those didn't work out or whether they did, those 2 parts were very sought after parts. But what I think is fascinating about the film, when you think of it, is that he chose to go forward with Rock Hudson, who was 28, Elizabeth Taylor, who was 23, and James Dean, who was 23, to play a story that covers 30 years.
I was, let's see, 1955, I was 29, I think. 29, yeah. And I had to be, in the movie, I had to be in the young 20s, 23, 24, 25. And then middle age, I guess 45 to 50. And then older age, I guess 65 to 70, about. Incidentally, I don't know if I had told you this, a couple of years ago, I was in Chicago, and Giant was being run on television late at night, and I just come back from the theater. And I don't like to watch films on television, particularly those that I am involved with. But I was curious, and so I knew when I would be the 45 to 50-year-old age, about what time. I tuned it in to look, and I looked at myself and ran to the mirror and looked in the mirror, and it was exactly the same, including where the gray is, where most of the gray is. To a T, it was exactly. So now I know what I'm going to look like when I'm 70.
It used to be in Hollywood that they would take mature actors, and when they had to shoot the young parts, make them up to look young and give them special lighting, special lenses, and so forth. And George had the idea to take young people because Elizabeth Taylor, Rock Hudson, Jimmy Dean were all in their 20s. And to, as the film progressed, to age them. So that was kind of a revolutionary thing to do.
One of the characteristics that marked my father was a tremendous self-confidence in terms of making films.
In getting from Los Angeles to the location of Giant in Marfa, Texas, we went on this one splendiferous train, a big long train with everybody on it. And it was an incredibly fun and interesting event just to get there, because there were so many of us.
Well, of course, we had Elizabeth Taylor playing, and who was 24 years old at the time. And I must say that I was, besides becoming really a friend, I mean, she was such a sweetheart. I had such great respect for her, for what she did in that movie. Here's a 24-year-old young actress playing, you know, at the end of the movie, so believably, that older Leslie Benedict. She was wonderful.
I knew Elizabeth when we were children, but I hadn't seen her I hadn't seen her for 3 babies, and I think she had 2 sons at the time, maybe. And the one thing that kind of brought us right away close together were our children, because we were both concerned as parents of leaving our children at home. So that was an immediate sharing of thoughts and feeling togetherness as 2 mummies who were working parents who had their kids at home. And then we both discovered we loved flowers. I am a flower freak. And we were on the train, we were peeping out the windows, and she said, "Oh, is that yucca out there?" And I said, "I think it is." And both of us were wild about yucca. And so Mr. Stevens came walking. He said, "What's all the giggling about, girls?" I said, "Oh, we just spotted some yucca growing, and we can't see it so far away, but oh, it's just wonderful." He said, "You want some yucca?" I said, "How would that be possible?" He said, "I think we can work it out." With that, he went out, and some cord was pulled, and the whole train stopped. And I have wonderful home movies. I'm so thrilled to have them, with Elizabeth, who looked so beautiful, with holding the yucca up, you know. And then it was just, so many things happened that were just fun, and all happy memories.
So it was at the very beginning of the film. And the night before, Elizabeth very nicely had asked my future wife and I to come over to she and Michael Wilding's house for dinner. Have an evening of getting acquainted, and it's going to be a long time together and so forth. So it was very nice and very polite of her to do so. And we did. And we had a wonderful time. And it was a very liquid evening. And several martinis later, suddenly realize it's 3 in the morning, and we have to get up and go to work and shoot this wedding scene. Well, Elizabeth had to get up, I guess, at 5:30. Girls don't have it as lucky as guys do. I had to get up around 6:30 or something. But we both were so dreadfully hungover, and we had to shoot this scene, this highly emotional scene, and not a word to each other, but just look at each other, just moony-faced. And we shot the scene and the sequence, and the hairdressers and the wardrobe girls and everybody were over there crying and carrying on. And the truth is, we were just so hungover that we couldn't do anything but just look.
My father made A Place in the Sun, which was the first really mature role that Elizabeth played, and that was a wonderful experience. And of course, it was a great film and a great role for her. And so when Giant came along, I think he knew that he'd been to the well with her and thought that she would be good for this part. And she really did. She did a wonderful job. She, like Rock, she had to age 25 or 30 years and go into territory that she hadn't been before.
I got some great pictures of Elizabeth. When one of my favorite one is in the movie film, but I have some wonderful black and white. She was always saying, for me, clowning, saying, "Oh, darling," you know. And I have a lot of "oh, darlings" of Elizabeth that I just love, in different outfits as she grew older through the years in the film.
I think Elizabeth was so wonderful for the part because one of the things that she does best is this haughty rich girl. And to see this lush green country that she came from in Virginia, where she rode horses and she was the queen, and then to see this flower from the east taken into the stark Texas countryside where there was nothing but dust and sagebrush and so forth. It was a wonderful, wonderful contrast. And I think she had some marvelous scenes that she did very, very well. Although I feel that as an actress, Elizabeth really came into her own a little bit later. It was a question of her, too, not quite having the confidence. People used to say to her, well, use your hands more, move a little more. And she didn't quite have the confidence to do that. She had had that MGM training where nothing moves, where you're just beautiful, but you're very, very still.
There was Elizabeth and there was Rock. I think Rock felt that was the best work he'd ever done, by far.
I loved Rock Hudson. I loved him as a person. He was a delicious human being, kind, thoughtful, conscientious about his fellow workers. I used to visit the set occasionally when he was working, and I knew Rock, not well, I always liked him, but I thought, thank you God, he's finally getting the opportunity to share the talent he's always had, but never had the proper words or script or lyrics to share with the public to show them what he's really capable of doing. I thank God that George Stevens saw that in him and gave him that chance, because I think it's the best film he ever did.
I loved him. I followed him around like a puppy. I worshiped that man. And so I saw perhaps a little more than maybe other people did.
He was handsome and sensuous and marvelous as the young man, and then I thought he really excelled as the elder man. I thought he did a wonderful job. He was inspired by the part, inspired by George Stevens. I thought he did a wonderful job.
Toward the end of the movie, when he had to wear the extra weight and the padding and everything showed in the long underwear things, you know, but he'd do the Charleston and everything just for my home movies, which was very different than his character on screen as Big Benedict, you know, whom he played in Giant.
Rock Hudson was 28 years old and hadn't played, very demanding roles. It was early in his career. And here he had to age from 28 to 58. And toward the end of the picture, of course, they would build him up in here with, padding and make him heavier and some gray in the hair. But there's a scene where he has an argument with Dennis Hopper late in the film. And I was on the set the day they did it here at the studio. And Dad had asked Rock to look at some Spencer Tracy pictures to get a feeling of how an actor, thinking that, that Tracy had a quality of an older man that would be useful to Rock. And he and Dennis took this scene, and it's a scene where they have an argument. And they rehearsed it, they walked around. Dad would always just kind of go in the set and let them do it. He wouldn't say, you stand there, you sit here. And they were going around having at it. And they did it for a little while. Dad used to say that he liked to let actors rehearse and run through things for a while until they felt the need for a little assistance, rather than coming in and saying, here's the way you do it. And he said to Rock, I'd like you to sit in that chair. And Rock went over and sat in this kind of straight, small chair. And then they did the scene. And Rock, played the scene, and then he got out of the chair when it got heated. Dad said, cut. He said, Rock, I want you to stay in that chair the entire scene. And it was such a wonderful thing, because you see that scene, Rock is sitting in that chair, and he is an old man, and the young boy has the vitality. And it was just one touch that made that scene work for Rock. And that's an example of how a director can help an actor.
I don't know how other actors felt, but I loved working with George. He was terrific. When we sat down to do the scene with Rock, when he called me into Rock Hudson's dressing room, and he was giving Rock liquor. It was about 9 in the morning, and he was going to do the scene all day long where Rock was kind of in his cups, or Bick was in his cups, and I remember he was giving him shots, getting old Bick into the mood, and he begins to talk. He says, "Wonder what this old son of a bitch wants." This is George talking. This old son of a bitch. I kept thinking, was it? And I realized he was being Bob Dace. What does this old son of a bitch want? This is the way he was giving me his direction. He suddenly became Bob Dace.
There was only one scene that I was in with Jimmy, when Rock and Elizabeth, when he had discovered oil and he came barreling up in his truck and had oil all over him. And they really had to plan it just like a dance routine. They had to do the choreography of the scene and how it was going to go. And it took a great deal of time in planning that scene. It was a very important scene in the film, one of the most important, really. But it was the only time, basically, the whole ensemble of the cast were together. But Rock and Jimmy, I have pictures that I took of them that I'm very proud of, because Rock always had this great sense of humor and fun. And he was always that way. And Jimmy was very, very stern and very concentrating on what he was doing, which was understandable. And I think they could have been real special friends if they'd had the time to be.
The only one who was unhappy about his aging was Jimmy. It wasn't that he minded aging. He didn't feel that he accomplished what he wanted to accomplish. He felt that he sort of let those scenes down in which he was an older man. As a matter of fact, in the scene where we see him drunk and destroyed in the ballroom, he was very unhappy with that scene and asked George if he could shoot it over and over and over again. My uncle, Chill Wills, and I were standing at a partially open door and watching this, and this was a big thing for Luz to see kind of the demise of her hero. Jimmy, in the rushes, came up to George Stevens and said, you know, he said, I wish that you would cut me out of that scene as much as possible because everything that there is to say is on Carol Baker's face. And that was a lovely thing to say. So he you know, he did appreciate other actors, other artists.
In the beginning, I was naturally very interested in Jimmy as an actor and as a person. I'd never ever met him. And he stayed very much to himself and was very, very distant. So I thought, okay, I will respect that and his privacy. So I stayed very distant. But he was the only one I did because everybody else were like teddy bears, you know, and I love teddy bears. So it took a while for us to finally kind of share thoughts, but he didn't allow that. If I would just say even good morning, he'd say hi, and with sort of the roll of the eyes and so on, but nothing in the way of communication. So finally, I was taking pictures, as I usually do, everybody, and having a wonderful time. And so finally he came up to me one day, and he said, you don't take any pictures of me. And I said, well, I wouldn't think of it. I said, you obviously enjoy being by yourself because you never come around and mingle with us, especially me. And I said, I try very hard to respect people's wishes as best I can. And I said, I wouldn't dream of bothering you in any way, shape, or form. He said, well, that's all right. He said, if you want to take some pictures of me, I don't mind. I said, honest engine, that'd be super. I'd love that. So that was the beginning. That was the first step. And the steps came more regularly and more often.
Interesting. Jimmy told me a story about how he had a big thing about means justifying, the end justifying the means, you know. But he also told me a story about how one day when he was driving in the hot desert, and that during, this hot summer in Texas, and it gets really hot, on those old blacktop highways, and he came upon a wreck. There'd been an accident, and a man had been injured, a black man, who was lying out on the side of the highway in this hot, boiling Texas sun. And it took an hour, a good hour, for them to get an ambulance there to help him, and the man was hurt. And Jimmy stood over him and afforded him shade for that hour, so that we could shade his face so he wouldn't be lying in that boiling sun. And he was very touched by the fact that the church, the preacher, the minister, had spoken about that, about his humanity, about stopping on the side of a road to help somebody. And he was very touched by the fact that they had talked about it in church.
I couldn't believe all that he went through before he did a scene. He'd limber up his shoulders and shake his fingers, and I'd look at him in awe. And finally one day I thought, I gotta find out what all that's about. So I went up and I said, Jimmy, will you answer a question for me? And he said, sure, what is it? I said, why do you do all of this and you bend over and you limber up your shoulders or whatever you're doing? He said, to get in the mood. I said, to get in the mood for what? He said, for what I'm supposed to do. I said, oh, he said, you never do anything. And I said, oh, you've noticed that? I said, well, I've never seen anything like what you've done ever before. Is this part of method acting? I said, I'm sorry, I've never had any acting lessons in my life, and I just do what my heart tells me, and I don't know any other way to do it. And I try to think about what character I'm supposed to be and what